Hello. So my name is Konrad, and it's my huge honor and pleasure to introduce to you Bert Cappelle, Associate Professor of English Linguistics at the University of Lille. Professor Cappelle is most well known for his work on grammatical constructions from a usage-based perspective. He watches how we use words in real life, and he argues that our grammar grows organically from everyday speech, a bit like sourdough and not from Chomsky's Cosmic Cookbook. Professor Cappelle is the original coiner of the widely used and influential term allostruction. But his curiosity doesn't stop at syntax. He also zooms in on how language gets weaponized in the political sphere. And if I'm not mistaken, this is how he's going. This is what he's going to focus on today. So thank you, Professor Cappelle. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Konrad. And also thank you, Wesley, for the very nice guitar introduction that I think hopefully most of us heard, apart from Konrad for some reason. But that was most appreciated. And Konrad, I really like your sourdough analogy, which I'm going to use, of course, with a due reference to the one that introduced it. But yeah, that's what I believe in. That our exposure to actual utterances and the constructions that emerge from them is what gets our grammar cognition going. Unfortunately, though, I'm not gonna look today at how language is used for political purposes. I like reading The Economist for its, political and societal views on all sorts of goings on in the world. But I'm just going to be the old-fashioned, ordinary linguist today and just focus on particular constructions that are used in The Economist, like fragments and imperative constructions in newspaper editorials, which is a genre where we don't necessarily expect these kinds of constructions to appear in. So this is the plan for this morning. I'll give a very general introduction to those two somewhat special clause types, and I'll do then a study or present a study on the use of these clause types in The Economist. And then we'll do a study indeed. This is going to be a little bit experimental. I'd like to do a replication study with the audience present here to see whether the findings that I obtained can be upheld with a small scale corpus of newspaper editorials. And then finally, very briefly, I'll take a look at how ChatGPT, a popular chatbot based on a large language model, how it fares when we give it the instruction to write in the style of The Economist. So as for those two rather special clause types, starting with fragments or fragmentary constructions, well, research has found that more than 1 in 10 of our utterances in dialogues are non-sentential. Now, what do we mean by non-sentential? Well, we mean, or I mean, but I'm not the only one. What I understand by this is that we're dealing with a sentence, an utterance, that lacks the typical canonical usual subject-predicate structure of the type "the cat sat on the mat." Now, here we already have an example, actually. I asked the question, and the answer is an example of such a non-canonical sentence structure. So that's an example of a fragment. Here are some further examples from dialogues. They used to come here for water and bunkers, you see, water and. So when the hearer wants to indicate that they haven't quite understood what the interlocutor said. Another example, these are authentic examples, by the way, from a corpus. Can I have some toast, please? Which sort? Here again, which sort does not have your canonical subject plus predicate structure. Or for a final example, who's that? And then you get a short answer, my Aunt Peggy, my dad's sister. So here again, the answer does not contain the usual expected vanilla flavored subject predicate structure. These are fragments. Now, what we often see is that a single proposition that could in principle be conveyed by means of a subject predicate structure is often realized in dialogues incrementally, you know, in just bits and pieces. So speaker A might say, well, I got it from that travel agents. Speaker B says, oh, are the one in the precinct? By booze. Oh, yeah. That's very typical of speech, of dialogues. The written analog of this would be something like, I got it from that travel agents by boots. Yeah. But so speech is rife with just fragments. And of course, if we look at speech like phenomena that are actually written, I'm referring here to text messages, then you would also see lots of those fragments like, okay, brilliant, oh wow, never, yeah, sure, good night, not that I know of, and many, many, many more. So I think it's fair to say, and this is pretty much common wisdom and received opinion, that the natural habitat of fragments is that of spoken discourse, or in any case, that of dialogues. Yeah, so I'm just gonna start from that assumption here. Moving on to imperatives, well, these two are found predominantly in conversation. So I'm using a table here, a frequency-based table, where each dot stands for 500 occurrences per million words from Biber et al.'s famous grammar. You have some imperatives in fiction, less so in news and in academic writing, but especially in conversation. And their use in conversation, you know, outnumbers that in fiction and the other genres by an order of magnitude, especially in news and academic writing. So the natural habitat of imperatives too seems to be that of spoken conversation, because it's well suited to the dynamic, the interactive nature of spoken conversation, because the imperatives convey requests or are used for giving directions, to give orders, or to give advice in any case. So they're very typical of settings where you have a speaker and a hearer present in the speech situation. Also, you have some imperatives like look or listen that are used as pragmatic discourse markers to grab a hearer's attention. And you would find them especially in spoken, you know, spoken language, not so much, of course, in written discourse. To summarize what I just said, and to build up to what I'm going to say, it seems quite unlikely to find fragments and imperatives in highly polished, non-literary prose, such as journalistic writing. It may seem a little bizarre for some of you that I'm giving a talk here on fragments and imperatives, which are not usually mentioned together. These are different constructions, of course, but I treat them together because they do have some features in common. They tend to be shorter than canonical sentences, which is very obvious for fragments because there is at least this this view that they are incomplete sentences, although that view is debated in some, construction grammatical circles, which wouldn't, readily agree that they have been derived, let's say, from full sentences. And imperatives too, typically, not necessarily always, but they typically lack a subject-noun phrase. Also, they may have non-truth conditional semantics, which is very obvious for imperatives. Directives can't, at least not in any obvious way, be said to be true or false. If I say close the window, you can't say, yeah, that's true, or no, that's not true. Fragments too often lack truth conditions. Just think of these examples. Good luck. Again, you can't say, yeah, that's correct. Or what to do. Again, you can't say that this is a false or a true sentence or proposition. And also some utterances, maybe that could have been a third item here. Some utterances may be both fragment and imperative at the same time. I'm focusing here on welcome, come in, welcome, have a seat. Welcome is used here alongside other imperatives, maybe because it is felt to be an imperative, something that could be short for perhaps be welcome. But it is not necessarily short for be welcome. It could also be a shortening of an optative, may you be welcome. In fact, though, welcome is not directly related to the verb come, and well then being an adverb to it, because it is, to be in all fairness, related to a verb-derived noun, kuma, which means guest. But, for contemporary speakers, welcome, as you can see in this triplet of, the other two are in any case imperatives. It can be felt to be some sort of imperative while at the same time being a fragment. Okay, let me then talk about a small-scale study that I did on the use of fragments and imperatives in The Economist. For those of you who don't know what The Economist is, this is a famous British weekly covering, as I hinted at, politics, current affairs, business, science, culture, societal matters of all kinds. It has been around for quite a while. It was founded in 1843. It's based in London, it still is. And it's known for its, not that it matters a lot, for its liberal economic perspective and its analytical depth. Why it stands out among other similar magazines or journals, it considers itself to be a journal, but it is a somewhat special journal in that there are no bylines, by which is meant that for the vast majority of articles in any case, we don't know who the author is. So the articles actually reflect a collective editorial voice, which enhances the clarity and the cohesion of its voice, you might say. More relevant to our concerns today is that it prides itself on its immaculate language. It's very witty and also very precise in its word choice. It uses irony, understatement a lot, and it has very nice, crisp, polished prose. Polished is of the essence here. It's also noteworthy in this respect to point out that since 1986 already, The Economist has published its own style guide, which is now in its 13th edition. So just to say again that The Economist prides itself on its correct, very well-honed, polished language use. Why am I stressing this? Well, because then it might seem odd that there should be any fragments or imperatives at all in this journal? Because, remember that I pointed out that these two constructions are typical of oral discourse phenomena. So what are they doing being used in that carefully edited written language that we find in The Economist? Well, one thing that we can be sure of is that those fragments and those imperatives will not have slipped through by accident, unlike what you may find in spontaneous speech, where fragments and imperatives can be used by accident, as it were, or without the user paying much notice. So in spontaneous speech, you might find mere interjections like what, or discourse markers, as I pointed out. In The Economist, however, they will be used on purpose. But it's still an empirical question to find out, to see whether they are used at all. Now, what triggered this somewhat unusual research, you might say, The Economist, and seeing whether fragments and imperatives are used in that journal? Well, I'm an Economist reader, and from my personal reading experience, I was struck by a kind of paradox. So first of all, I did notice that fragments and imperatives were used, and that led me thinking. So I said, well, journalists may use them to make their text livelier with what are known to be ordinary oral style patterns. But by using them, as we'll see, in special positions in the text, because they are not used randomly within the text, they are used in very special positions. Those ordinary sentence patterns are again made extraordinary. So it's a little bit, as you can see, like, towards the hearer, did you notice what an absolutely normal construction I used here? So, yes, it's an ordinary construction, but its presence in a text that is not its natural habitat makes the use of that ordinary sort of sentence type not ordinary at all. Now, here's an example. I'm just going to read it, or at least the final bit of the first paragraph in boldface. There is no argument among medical professionals about the value and the importance of gender-affirming care. And then the second paragraph starts, except that there is. This is a fragment. Is it, though? Is except that a fragment? Now, how do we define fragments? I haven't given a definition yet. Well, fragments are, according to at least one scholar, standalone constructions which, despite their reduced non-canonical fragmentary structure, are still semantically, discursively, and pragmatically equivalent to a complete clause construction. So is except that equivalent to a complete clause construction? Put differently, can it be completed? So let's go back to our example. Except that there is could perhaps be extended or completed as this, what was just said is true, except that there is such an argument. Because remember, the previous sentence was, there is no argument among blah, blah. So is except that a fragment? Yes, it can be reconstructed into a full sentence. But that full sentence, I don't know whether you agree with me here, or maybe you will have felt that when you read it, that full sentence is not semantically fully coherent. At least if we take except literally to announce a particular circumstance, or a particular fact, or a particular person or thing to which a previous statement does not apply. Now, the ordinary use of except is, as in this sentence, I like every fruit except for bananas. Now, we didn't have that in this second paragraph that I displayed. because except that, used as a fragment sentence, is often used as a well-established rhetorical trick to set up a wrong expectation. Or it is used as part of that rhetorical trick. So what we have in the first paragraph is something like, whatever, blah, blah, blah. Except that, and here the hearer may expect just to hear a minor detail that takes away some of the truth of what had been said so far. But then very often there is complete refutation of what preceded. And so then the hearer will recognize that maybe some sort of sarcasm was involved, or that the hearer had been set up, was led to believe that everything that preceded was true, was correct. And so that the hearer just had to go along with some plausible seeming view, which isn't plausible at all. So here are some further examples of what can be called complete refutation, except. We all know evolution, is about improvement and progress, except, of course, it isn't at all. Or, fun fact, Captain Man is really good at the internet, except that he isn't at all. Or, and this one sounds really sarcastic, great argument, except for the tiny detail that it's complete BS. Now, except is not really, and forgive me the poor pun, is not really exceptional in this regard, because but too is a contrastive marker, as in he claimed he was ill, but of course he wasn't. But its etymology is butan, which meant outside of, or without, or except, and there's still a Dutch adverb, which is buiten, which means exactly, outside. But which can also mean except, actually. The same is true for only, which likewise expresses the idea of exception, as in I'm the only gay in the village, but which has also developed that complete refutation meaning, as in he claimed to have won the championship 3 times, only it's not true. In reality, he's never won the championship even once. So let's go back once more to our example, except that there is. So it's not really clear whether this is detached from the previous sentence. So where, in fact, it's a kind of an alternative spelling punctuation where, we could have had a comma and the same sentence, the same paragraph too. Or is there an implicit matrix clause of its own? We can't answer that question. And either way, what we're dealing with here is a case of the phenomenon that has been well described by many researchers, a case of insubordination. So that is when we have what looks like a subclause, we have the complementizer that after all, but which is functionally speaking a main clause. So are fragments really remnant bits? Well, I would say no, because there are clearly fragment constructions without any deleted material. Just look at these examples. And now for whatever, for anything can be that noun phrase, or no worries, or good luck with X, or Y verb phrase, optionally if, and then something else. None of these have any obvious way of being completed to full sentences. So these are, you can call them fragments, but that term is then a bit of a misnomer because we don't know what they are fragments of. They are, sui generis sentence patterns. And I think something similar might be said for the except that clause. Let's have a final look at our example. Except that there is. I pointed out that and you can see it, of course, for yourselves, that it appears at the start of the second paragraph. That's a special position. So you might say that fragments and imperatives occupy a special position in editorial writing, but you can take that quite literally. They do occupy a special position. They are given a special place, a kind of non-random position. So I'm not talking even about the metaphorical use of having a special position. I'm actually talking about the place where we find those fragments. They are not used randomly. So how many such cases are there in The Economist? It's not easy to find out. As for imperatives, you could say, yeah, these are quite easy to detect automatically or semi-automatically using software. So what you could do is upload a corpus of The Economist articles in, for example, Sketch Engine, have it tagged within Sketch Engine, and then perform a search for a bare verb at the start of a sentence. And that doesn't have an interrogative mark at the end. So you would find lots of imperatives. But fragments are messier. What exactly is left out, if anything? So doing a corpus search on imperatives, doable on fragments, it's going to be hard. So my solution is, and I put solution between scare quotation marks, is to just read articles manually, of course, not with hands, but with human eyes. Good. So I compiled a mini corpus of editorials from The Economist. It's really a very small scale corpus, 72,000 words. That's, I mean, no one would call that by today's standards a corpus. It's just a mini collection of texts. Yeah, it's a corpusculum, if you like. Now, those editorials, we don't know who authored them, because there is no mention, as I said, of the author, of the journalist. Maybe they have been co-authored. That is something that The Economist says itself. Leaders, that's the name, by the way. Leaders is the name that The Economist gives to its editorials. Are discussed and debated each week in meetings that are open to all members of the editorial staff. Journalists often cooperate on articles, and some articles are heavily edited. Accordingly, articles are often the work of The Economist's hive mind rather than of a single author. So, a question is, might fragments and imperatives reflect linguistic habits, perhaps of just a single editor-in-chief or a single editorial assistant? There is that possibility that, journalists submitted a draft version with no fragments, no imperatives at all, and that all the imperatives and all the fragments that we do find are the work of a single editorial assistant. There is that possibility, but I think it's not very likely. It can't be excluded, though. But here's the research question. Where do we find fragments and imperatives in The Economist editorial? There are two sub-questions here. Where do we find them in the entire text? And where do we find them within a paragraph? Of course, some data were excluded, as in headlines. Headlines, we know, are often telegrammatic anyway, so they would just inflate the count. So this is from, you will notice that, from a somewhat older editorial. Lula will be Brazil's next president. Now for the hard part. So now for the hard part actually looks like a legitimate fragment. It is something that could appear not only in the headline, but also in the main text, but it wasn't counted. Or sometimes we have, let me just go back to the previous slide. We also have sometimes both an imperative and a fragment. I don't have an example here on the slide, but from memory and from the notes, which I can read, we may have something like this: back Bibi. Bibi is then Benjamin Netanyahu, and then the Economist had as a subtitle, seriously, acknowledging here that it's a somewhat weird, and especially today, this is a very topical talk. It might be very odd to have an article that says back Netanyahu, hence the addition of seriously. So we have our reasons when we say something that might seem out of the ordinary. So back baby is an imperative, seriously would be fragment, but that would have been excluded. By the way, that was in 2022 that The Economist had that as a headline. But even then, The Economist knew that it was a somewhat controversial way to say back baby. Anyway, I'm not talking politics here, I'm talking linguistics. Fragments and imperatives can also appear in subheadings. These often use regular syntax, including legitimate fragments and imperatives, like most people on antidepressants don't need them. Time to wean them off. That's a legitimate fragment, but it was not included anyhow. Or free the North, fire up Britain's economy by invigorating its second-tier cities. These seem like legitimate fragments and imperatives, but sometimes there's no principled way to distinguish real from title-like, headlineese like fragments, as in the next examples that I'm not going to read out for lack of time. Also excluded, rather, are fragments that don't appear as independent clauses, so after an em dash or after a semicolon. Yeah. They really had to appear with a capital letter and a final punctuation mark. Also excluded as a second category are these. In these examples, the bold-faced part can be seen as shortenings of, in the first case, what is worse, or what is, in the second example, what is perhaps most important. But these structures haven't been counted as fragments for the same reason that most researchers would disregard sentence initial occurrences of first or second or last, etc., which could also be viewed as short for the first or the second or the last thing is that. And likewise, I excluded discourse structuring constituents such as more than that, or what's more. The latter is a clause, what's more, but could still be seen as missing a main verb and complementizer. What is more is that, but it is often used as a disjunct. So these were excluded pretty much for the same reason that we would also exclude adverbs like moreover. So I'm spending a lot of time, I realize that, to categories that were excluded. Left or right dislocated constituents, 2 were excluded, as in these examples. Actually, the second example was called also in my paper a right dislocated constituent. After that, colon there. There are a few good options, but one leaps out and then you get something. Actually, now I realize this is not a case of right dislocation. It's actually just providing a value for something that had been announced in the previous part of that sentence. And then structures expressing alternative or universal conditionals, as in, but Xi Jinping and the Communist Party are rushing ahead, ready or not, which is short for whether they are ready or not, or whatever your politics, etc. These were excluded. And a final category of excluded fragments are elliptical phenomena inside sentences, as in the first case, which is an example of what is known as sluicing, to use a term well known in the generative literature. But I mean, that is the term that a linguist adhering to any sort of theoretical framework would have to use. And neither will voters. So that is a case of verb phrase ellipsis. Ellipses and fragments are closely related phenomena, but not every instance where material is missing is a true fragment. And so for the purposes of my study, a fragment must be used as a self-standing utterance, even though it has the formal features of something that is generally part of a larger whole. Imperatives then. Well, for imperatives, I actually relaxed the criterion that they must occur as freestanding sentences. So here, where we have coordination, I counted both imperatives here as indeed imperatives. So, as for the results of that study, how many fragments and imperatives do we have? Remember, we had a very small corpus, 88 editorials. Of those 88 editorials, 54, more than half, contained at least one fragment or imperative. And in the total corpus, there were 49 fragments, 43 imperatives. Here's the breakdown. There were 34 texts that didn't have any, and 32 texts that had one. And then, of course, the numbers go down for editorials that had two or more fragments / imperatives. You will remember, though, that what I'm primarily interested in is where we find those fragments and imperatives. Now, if we look at the whole text, then here we have a graph where in gray, the bars in gray represent the number of fragments and imperatives that could be expected if they occurred, randomly, if they were not being given special positions. So for the first paragraph, we don't see any marked increase or decrease in the number of paragraphs or imperatives vis-a-vis what could be expected. But in the second paragraph, we find more imperatives and fragments than could be expected. And also in the final paragraph, we find more of them. Yeah. And I already gave an example, and I displayed it several times. You will remember that paragraph with "except that there is." That is a kind of quite typical use of a fragment at the start of a second paragraph. Well, I say at the start of the second paragraph. Here we don't see in this graph where those fragments and imperatives appear within a paragraph, but here then is a graph for where we find imperatives and fragments within a paragraph, so across sentences in a paragraph. And here clearly we see that while not many imperatives and fragments could be expected to be in the first or in the last sentence, that is really where they occur a lot, way more than expected. Now, what we can do is plot these two ways of identifying fragments and imperatives together in one graph, and that is done here at the bottom. So the x-axis is the position of fragments; these are the brown dots, and imperatives; these are the yellow ones. within the text. So the further to the left, the more at the start of the text you would find, or these fragments and imperatives actually occurred, the more towards the right you have dots. That's, well, simply because they were used in those positions. And then for the y-axis, the closer to the bottom indicates fragments and imperatives at the start of a paragraph, and at the top of the graph, these are imperatives and fragments in the final sentence of a paragraph, indeed. Now, you can see that we have lots of paragraphs, lots of fragments, I beg your pardon, and imperatives at the very rightmost corner. So these are fragments and imperatives in the final paragraph and in the final sentence of that final paragraph. And then you will also see a cluster not at the bottom of the graph, not quite at the left, but somewhere close to the left. Well, these are the ones that appear in the second paragraph. So I have another example of that from the Economist, from one of those editorials, where we have an opening paragraph, blah, 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 blah. What could possibly go wrong for a party with such a figurehead, or for one whose primary voters are keen to relitigate the 2020 election, that they chose a slate of candidates in key Senate seats, chiefly for being the true keepers of the Trump flame. Quite a lot, it turns out. Yeah? So this is a sort of rhetorical question, where the rhetorical question is one that is conventionalized. What could possibly go wrong is often used to say, yeah, a lot could go wrong. And so the second paragraph indeed says that quite a lot, it turns out. What we have here, I'm a construction grammarian, but what we have here, I believe, is an instantiation of a construction that spans 2 paragraphs in length. Because we know, and this is one of the basic tenets of construction grammar, we know that constructions range from very small to potentially very big, and that they don't stop at the boundaries necessarily of a single sentence. So you might also have discourse level constructions. And this is one of them, I believe, where in the first paragraph of a text, we get a viewpoint that is to be contested. It is received opinion, it's the view of someone or of people under discussion, or it is a generally plausible view. And then the second paragraph has a fragment or imperative that says something like, and that's the function, that view is wrong, followed by argumentation for why it is wrong. Okay, there are some recurring types in The Economist. So we have paragraph initial imperatives that push the reader along. For example, to understand Vladimir Putin, hear what he says about his enemies. Or to understand why, look beyond the hurly-burly, blah, blah, blah. If this judgment sounds severe, look at blah, blah, blah. Or start with, or take spending cuts as an example. We also have imperatives as conditionals. This is a well-known sort of construction. Look beyond the boom and bust of consumer tech, though, and you see the real successes, which is functionally equivalent to if you look beyond blah, 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 you will see. Or strip out volatile food and energy prices, though, and blah, blah, blah. Or add to that, blah, 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 and the case. So that's a well-known pattern, but we find it a lot. What we also find a lot are fragments with better to, or better not to, or better with an adverb inserted to, as in the first example, better instead to let the market set the exchange rate. or better to phase out the triple lock, blah, 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 or better not to pretend it is an option. These are very speech-like, they're very short. Sometimes I have the impression that fragments are used in editorials because they save space. Yeah? That could also be a very practical reason for using them. The same goes for why verb. But it is not just a space saver, because why verb comes with rich pragmatic meaning. It's enriched with a sort of hypothetical volitional modal meaning. So the intended meaning of the first one, for example, is why would you want to comply with onerous rules if you don't have to? Here's another recurring type, no little wonder that. So no wonder that, or little wonder that. No wonder that some financial institutions are getting cold feet about green alliances, or little wonder people have taken to the streets. So with or without that complementizer. The overall purpose is, of course, the purpose of not my study, but of including fragments and imperatives in an editorial, is that, well, these are conventional structures to make the text breezier, less stuffy, less sterile, less written-like. And so they pattern with other speech-like features that have been increasingly found in the written mode, like contracted verb forms, or and or but at the start of sentences, which was long prescribed against, or those dashes that you find a lot for so-called spontaneous additions. Fragments and imperatives have their own particular place alongside those oral-like features in the text. They have their own place, but also note they have been given special positions in The Economist. If you want to read that at your own pace, this has been published quite recently in English Language and Linguistics. It's an open access article, so everyone is free to read that. I'm done for the presentation of my study, and what I would like to do is do a replication of that study on a smaller, because it was already a small corpus, but on an even smaller corpus of fragments and imperatives from The Economist. So I have two identical QR codes because sometimes part of the screen is blocked. So maybe they are both visible, in which case, all the finer. So if you could use your devices perhaps to scan that QR code, that should give you access to a small corpus. I'm kind of waiting for a signal, maybe in the chat, to see whether that works at all. I see that there's a Google Docs attendance list. That's not what I'm referring to. But okay, Samantha and some others, Wesley, also assure me, and I'm pleasantly surprised to see that Samantha is here, but I told her not to be here. But she is. So excellent. If you have access to that small-scale corpus, then I would like you to maybe do something else. If you have a sheet of paper, you could perhaps produce a graph like this. So two axes with the x-axis being the axis of where fragments and imperatives appear within the text. So I'm giving, I'm recognizing 4 positions here. The first paragraph, the second paragraph, which we know is a special paragraph, perhaps potentially. Any sort of middle paragraph that is then defined as a paragraph that is not the first, not the second, and not the final paragraph. And then, of course, we also need the final paragraph. And then on the y-axis, we have beginning, middle, and end of the paragraph. So this is now a sort of course, basically, more than me giving a conference talk, but we have 2 hours at our disposal, and I didn't want to talk for 2 hours. So if you have access to that corpus, I'm going to take a look at the chat here again. In that first text, Trump's incoherent trade policy will do lasting damage. Do you notice any fragment sentence and any imperative? So if you find it, maybe you can type it in the chat. I'm not sure whether you can actually use your microphones or not. But if you can type a fragment that you may have spotted, that would be ever so kind. And you don't have to look far for identifying that first fragment in that first text. If you type, you don't have to type the whole sentence, even though fragments are by definition a bit short. The first words might do. I don't see anything yet. But remember, I just said that you don't have to look very far to encounter the first fragment. That's a big hint, actually. And so you don't have to look at the headline. I don't see any typing, but yes, Samantha is there. And indeed, we have, after the terror, the euphoria. Yeah, and that's also what Konrad said. So that indeed is a fragment. Good. So I'm going to take note of that on my graph, and you can do that too, if you like. I'm not going to do that here on the slide, but I'm doing it on a piece of paper. So I'm putting just a dot, any symbol is fine, near first paragraph, because it appears in the first paragraph, and also close in that graph because it's at the beginning of a paragraph. Do we have another fragment somewhere in that in that text? No fragment, but do we have an imperative, perhaps? I'm glad to see that Ravina also found that fragment. And indeed, Samantha, we have, but do not mistake. So that is indeed an imperative. You don't have to use a different symbol for fragment and imperative necessarily. So that's at the start of a paragraph, and it's at the start of the second paragraph, isn't it? So that's a special position. Good, thanks for that. That's all we need to find in that first text, because I did that exercise myself, of course, at home in preparation. Let's move to the second text. Spot. So that's Donald Trump's oddly sensible move, seeking a deal with Iran. So that's still kind of topical. It's an older editorial, but spot the fragment sentence in this text. Let's see if I can give you a hint. It is at the end of a paragraph. And indeed, that's the one. Thanks, Samantha. It's very good to have you here this morning. Better surely, and Konrad too. That again is a fragment. You could say it's short for "it is better surely." It's one of those recurring fragments. As it happens, it occurs in the second paragraph, doesn't it? But at the end of the second paragraph. So I'm putting a dot on my graph here at the top of the graph, but you know, in the category, if you like, second paragraph. Your graph doesn't have to look very neat, but we'll see. We'll see what the result is at the end. I'm moving on to the third text. There are 10 texts in all, so this will take some time. So how AI could help the climate. Spot the imperative. Again, it appears in a somewhat conventional place for an economist editorial. Indeed, consider AI's appetite for energy first. I'm putting a dot here on my graph next to where I already had a dot, second paragraph, beginning of that paragraph. Moving on to the next text, Zuckerberg on trial. Spot the fragment sentence and the special imperative. Here you'll have to, I'm just helping you along a little bit, you'll have to move to the second page at least of that text to find a fragment. And the imperative also comes later. Yes, we already have it. What of the experience? Thank you, Konrad. So where is that? I would say that is a middle paragraph, isn't it? And it appears at the beginning of that middle paragraph. It's not exactly the middle paragraph, but it's one of the middle paragraphs. And then there's still an imperative that we need to find. Ask a parent, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, that's that special type again where it's functionally similar to a conditional. So that's again a middle paragraph sort of imperative which appears at the start of that middle paragraph. Yeah, good. Moving on to the next text, the lesson of Birmingham's striking binmen. Spot the two imperatives of sorts. I'm not sure whether these are imperatives, but in any case, Konrad spotted one of them. Never mind, never you mind, never mind. It's kind of imperative indeed. I'm glad that Konrad agrees with me on that. So that's at the end of the second paragraph. I'm putting a dot next to where I already had a dot. And thank you for your participation. This is slow linguistics, but it's going kind of fast. We're getting results. There should be another sort of imperative. Cue a bonanza indeed. Thank you. That's at the start of, let's see if it's not the final paragraph. No, it's not. Of any sort of middle paragraph. If you're doing the exercise with me, a pattern is already emerging, right? Okay. Moving on to our next text. Don't overlook the many benefits of plastics. Spot the imperative for that one. take food, yeah, as an example. Excellent. That's, if I'm not mistaken, a middle paragraph imperative occurring at the start of that middle paragraph, putting a dot next to 3 dots that I already had there. And we can move to, I hope my pages, the rustling of my pages is not too annoying, to the next text. Trump is revolutionary, will he succeed? Spot the fragment sentence in that one. Where could it be? Have we already found a fragment at the end of the text? No, we haven't, but Konrad was keen enough to look for one there. And indeed, it's the final sentence of the final paragraph. So I'm putting a dot here in the rightmost corner of my graph. Only 1,361 days left. Good. Only a couple of texts left, I hope. Spot the fragment sentence in the next text, which is again about Trump. It's going to be a similar one, not similar in position. Do you find a fragment? Of course, what we're doing here is probably look for fragments in special places. That's not the way research should proceed, because that is some sort of observer's bias that we may fall prone to here. But for the sake of this exercise, it's, I would say, okay. Don't you see the fragment in the text that starts with President Trump's attacks on the Fed are not over? What about the first paragraph? Yes, only until the president's mood swings again, or a different advisor has his ear. That is a fragment indeed. Thank you, Samantha. And so that's in the first paragraph at the end of that paragraph. So that is a position where no dot have been put yet on my graph, but there's a dot now. So that's it for that text. I'm flicking through my printed out document here. Spot the imperative now in the text, Africans need jobs. Ignore it at your peril. Thanks, Konrad. That is again an imperative in a special position because it's in the second paragraph and at the end of that paragraph. Yeah. So I have now 3 dots there for that position. I'm moving on to maybe one of the last texts, I believe. Not quite the last one, the last but one. How to keep AI models on the straight and narrow. Spot the 2 imperatives and the fragment sentence. Okay, we already have what to do. That's indeed correct. That is in the middle paragraph at the start of that middle paragraph. But we also have give it the job which is at the end of the first paragraph. But there is another imperative in that same paragraph. In the first paragraph. I don't know if anyone sees it. Yes, give an AI system, blah, blah, blah. Good. Thank you. Excellent. So that is in the first paragraph, in the middle, we might say, of that paragraph. So that was a category that we didn't have yet. Good. And then we're moving to, because we had what to do, we took note of that. We're moving to the final text, where I'm inviting you to spot the imperative, if that is indeed what it is. Yes, cue outrage from environmentalists. I believe we already had one like those. Where does that occur? I need to see the start of that text. It's the start of the third paragraph. So it's a middle paragraph. It appears at the middle of that paragraph. So thank you very much for your kind cooperation in this replication study, if you like, mini replication study. I'm done here with my results. I don't know if you can see me on the screen. I can't see myself, and I don't know if you can see my graph being held up here. But this is what it looks like, and maybe yours looks similar. We have a giant empty space, whoops, in the middle. Yeah, so that's bizarre. If fragments and imperatives were used in a haphazard, random way, that space here should have been filled out more or less evenly, but it isn't. We see a huge concentration of fragments here at the bottom of the graph, because they appear at the start of a paragraph. We see lots of them, also at the end. Well, not as many as there are at the start of a paragraph, but we see lots of them at the end of a paragraph. There's this one isolated one that appears in a middle sentence of a paragraph, but that's actually a very nice replication, and the findings here for this replication study are, I'm sad to say, even nicer than the published results of my somewhat more extended research. But I should actually be happy with this, because that kind of confirms what that research study, small scale though it was, had found. I'm almost done. There will be some time for brief discussion, but I want to quickly go to this final question: can ChatGPT handle fragments and imperatives? So let me go to April 6th, 2023, when I started experimenting a lot with ChatGPT. Well, I had already experimented a lot with it, but I mean, these were early days, fairly early days, let's say, of ChatGPT. Don't mind the typo in my question. There's an S missing there. Make sure your article really comes across. But I mean, ChatGPT, of course, doesn't mind. So I asked it to write an article in the style of The Economist, and about climate change, and it did that. It's very good at producing texts in a flash. The text goes on, but I wasn't happy because there weren't any fragments or imperatives. And so I said, yeah, nice, good job, blah, blah. But I asked ChatGPT to maybe include a few non-canonical sentences like what to do or to see why, consider the currency markets, or good luck with that. And so, yeah, it tried to do that, but instead of using something like what to do, it used a full sentence, a full interrogative, but what can be done to address the challenges we face? And then it went on with to see why, consider the complex web of factors. Sorry, but ChatGPT wasn't doing a very good job here. Now, fast forward to kind of last month, where I did the exercise again. I asked ChatGPT, which by now ran under a different model, can you write an article on climate change in the style of an editorial from The Economist? Certainly, ChatGPT said, here's an editorial style article on climate change, written in the voice and tone typical of The Economist. The slow burn, why governments must stop dithering on climate change. The world is on fire. I'm not going to read the whole text, but already the difference in quality is remarkable. We have something that already looks like an article from The Economist with an actual title, a subtitle, yeah, with lots of dashes. That's kind of also typical of ChatGPT anyway. But I don't know if you scanned through this text now that you have the hang of it. No fragments, no imperatives here, nor here in the next paragraphs, nor here. Some short sentences: insurers' premiums rise, harvests fail, displacements grows, but no fragments or imperatives, except at the very, very end, in a very typical position for a fragment, but only if we act like we intend to save it. The last sentence of the final paragraph. So here I thought that ChatGPT did a very good job indeed. Hooray for ChatGPT, hooray for its success at using, in this case, a fragment sentence appropriately and in a position typical of an editorial in The Economist. Okay, I'm done here. I'll leave the floor to Konrad, who may, ask the audience to ask a few questions.